Hello, and welcome back to the NearSight and FarSight podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Taylor. Today, we're going to talk about something that a lot of our clients have been coming to us with that we wanted to explain a couple of the core concepts regarding, and that's the discussion on inflation. There are two sides to the inflation discussion, and we'd like to define a couple of those things and talk about what's happening currently that has led us to the situation that we're in right now. Those two sides are demand pull and cost push. These are two sides to the inflation equation that help us understand the sources of where inflation is coming from and about how much longer we can anticipate inflation to affect the rising cost of goods and services. So join us as we talk about those two things and answer hopefully a couple of your questions regarding this current macroeconomic condition. First, I'd like to talk about demand pull. This is traditionally referred to as too many dollars chasing too few goods. It's a very traditional understanding of what causes inflation. The rising costs of goods and services is directly impacted when there's more and more dollars in the market. And I think this increase in the number of dollars in the market have come in three phases. The first of which, all the way back in 2008. The Economic Rescue, Recovery, and Rebuilding Act under the Obama administration really kickstarted a huge money printing effort to alleviate liquidity issues that were right on the heels of the financial crisis. As people couldn't lend and borrow, we needed to have more money into the system. And that money never really dries up. It never really goes away without some other policy to extract both the lending needs and the amount of money that's kind of floating around out there. So that was wave one. We were already living in the last decade and a half in a regime of excess amount of capital in the system. And that amount of capital has only climbed throughout that. Now that has fueled a lot of the increases that we've seen in the S&P 500 and other equity markets. The second phase that I think people should be aware of was Trump's Jobs Cuts Act, the Jobs and Tax Cut Act. This lack of taxation keeps money in the balance sheets of corporations. Again, a huge kickstart to the performance of the S&P 500, but it leaves a lot of capital floating around in the markets, both to buy goods and services, to increase wages. There's just simply more money in the hands of people and companies, which drives up the costs, the rising costs of those goods and services. So this happens on the heels of that. There's still no policy to rein in the amount of money that's floating around out there, and left a lot more money on the balance sheets for companies and people to go out there and pay more for goods and services. And then came the pandemic. The COVID response, the Payroll Protection Act, the expanded unemployment, a couple of the liquidity measures from the Fed have issued a ton of money that's now floating around in the markets. So this is a long time coming. There was a first wave that created too much money. There was a second wave that had created too much money. And these last two, both the Jobs and Tax Cuts Act and the pandemic response, are not accretive. They're not going into parts of the market. They're not like a discussion in infrastructure. They're just liquidity measures. Because we wanted people to continue to work, because we needed people to continue to spend, that created a lot of money that the government was creating to push out into the world, whether you were employed or not. This is not economically expansive. Neither the tax cuts have been economically expansive, nor has the COVID response, but rather they were responses to other measures happening in the economy, the pandemic being chief amongst them. So this has created three waves that have created a lot of capital, a lot of money that can flow around in the demand side of the equation. Second, we want to talk about the cost push. This is generally driven by two elements within the inflation equation. The first of which is a rising cost of wages, how much it costs for people to service your account at the bank, to build your house, driven largely by wages. The second of which is the rising cost of raw materials. This comes from an equation based on the aggregate supply of those materials in the market. And while wages domestically have been competing on two fronts, The first of which is the unemployment was very, very low prior to the pandemic. This generally means that companies have to pay more and more in the form of labor to get those in the form of wages to get that labor recruited to their company. We were starting to see the initial effects of that prior to the pandemic. The initial, rising in labor costs, and then the pandemic struck and kind of put a lot of that to the wayside. So the second effect that companies are dealing with comes in the form of employers competing with the Payroll Protection Act and the expanded unemployment packages at the states. So again, there's a lot of money that keeps labor on the sidelines. That means that companies are having to pay more and more to recruit that labor back into the workforce. A continuation of both a low unemployment environment and this extra factor that they're competing with the government. The rising cost of raw materials. Generally, I'm feeling like this is a kind of a knock-on effect of the trade war. 3 years ago, when we were going through kind of the bowels of the trade war, people were talking about how this is going to have a long-term impact on the rising cost of raw materials, most of which come from China. So this is having an effect on our lumber, our iron, our copper, major intrinsic valuable raw materials that we need to get into the market to build buildings, to make the economy go, to build semiconductors. All of these are really core to that. So the rising cost of those raw materials is a major prevailing headwind for the rising cost of inflation. The second of which in the raw materials discussion is the disjunction, the disunion by how industries have come back from the pandemic. Just because there are people with hammers and shovels ready to go back and build buildings doesn't mean that they've had the girders and the pipes to put into those buildings. And because everything kind of got switched on at the same time, there's elements up the supply chain that have not yet produced the inventory that's required down chain. Well, this is where we're actually measuring. We're measuring the rising cost of televisions and Ford trucks and even going out to eat. We're measuring all of those end of the supply chain numbers in the consumer price index. But if you look further up in the manufacturing indexes, all of those are going to come back online. We think that this is largely a transitive effect of just trying to snap on the economy, everybody go back to work. It means that the supply generating portions of the economy have not yet reached all the way downstream to where the consumer goods are. And so we just think that that's a transitive disunion in the inflation debate right now. Thanks again for tuning in. This has been the NearSight and FarSight podcast, and I've been your host, Kevin Taylor. Great, thanks. That's awesome. Well, this has been part 2 in the series. If you missed out on part 1, please rewind. Go find either on YouTube or on the investmentwithinsight.com website, the first part where we actually discuss the market set and the market opportunities. And in part 3, we're going to discuss with John and with Luis the performance of their fund and a little bit more detail as to how they get there. Thanks again. This has been NearSight and FarSight with the investment professionals at Insight. Thanks.